Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on India's national broadcaster Doordarshan about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and key strategic partnerships that India has developed with important countries around the world. Viewers, in this episode, we are going deep into one of India's most enduring and durable strategic partnerships. This is with Russia. The Russia-India friendship goes back several decades and has lasted through tumultuous changes in the world orders. So why is Russia-India strategic partnership still so relevant, and what are the efforts being made by both sides to renew and revitalize this age-old friendship, and what is the impact of the Russia-India strategic partnership on other players around the world? These are the themes of this episode. And to take us through this, I have with me a very knowledgeable expert who is Russian and lives in India, and is a fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, Dr. Aleksei Zhakarov. Dr. Zakharov is an expert on international relations of Eurasia and the Indo-Pacific, and has written extensively about Russia-India relations. Dr. Zakharov, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
So we had the 23rd annual summit between the two countries, and one of the phrases that stayed in my mind was Prime Minister Narendra Modi saying that this relationship is like a North Star or a Pole Star, he called it, Dhruv Tara in Hindi, meaning that it's always constantly there and guiding us in the sky, and despite major shifts and turbulence and uncertainties around the world. So let's start with this, Dr. Zakharov. Looking back and until the present, what is the glue that has held these two countries together? I mean, some people say there are no permanent friends or enemies, there are only, permanent interests, quoting a British politician of the 19th century. But it looks like with Russia and India, it's permanent, right? It is permanent, and it defies this logic or this rule. So what is this, endurance, and why do you think, what is the Russian view of India that has sustained over so long? Why they value India so much?
I think there are many factors that explain this endurance. Of course, largely it has to do with historical memory. I think during the Cold War era, there was this foundation that was laid by the Soviet Union by helping India to develop many of its industries, like the steel industry, for instance, or some of the energy industries, like, for instance, exploration of oil or construction of refineries. It also there in the Indian memory that the Soviet Union was helpful during some of the crises, like the 1971 is a well-known story. And also vice versa, I think that India was also kind of helpful on many accounts because there was no points of contentions between the two countries, and there were some geopolitical differences between them, how they viewed China and the United States at some points of history. But at the same time, issues like Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, for instance, were not generating so much of friction between the two countries. Also in the 1990s, for instance, when the Soviet Union collapsed and was not in a position to follow up many of the initiatives that were initiated by the Soviet government, India was quite patient with the Russian state of turbulence. And in fact, India helped the Russian military-industrial complex to stay afloat by posing and by requesting new orders and paying for them. That's why I think that this connection is very long-standing, enduring, and quite solid. And of course, some of the areas which are already, well-known, like defense cooperation, have seen a very close collaboration between the two countries, including the Russian transfer of technologies, because at some point the Soviet Union was more willing than other Indian partners to share its best solutions in this sphere. And I think that's how Indian reliance and Indian relationship with Russia in defense was built. And I think it's still relevant in this point of time.
Absolutely. Yeah, so there's a lot of, trust that has been built up through historical memory, and that's an important point. And for post-colonial nations, historical memory is very significant, and, it shapes the psyche. So you ask an average person, the love for Russia is tremendous, right? So in India, and it explains that. Dr. Zakharov, our External Affairs Minister, Subramaniam Jaishankar, mentioned that the 23rd Russia-India summit was about reimagining the relationship, and there was a lot of focus on building new and alternative, pillars on which to broad base the relationship, because historically it's been defense, like you said. Last few years, it's also been oil and energy. But going beyond these two traditional pillars, there is an effort by both sides to, diversify, right? So let's talk a bit about that. What are the, economic fields in which we can diversify? The joint statement after the 23rd summit mentioned many areas. So which are the, sectors or specific industries where you think Russia-India can ramp up? Because right now, the bilateral trade is skewed, and Russia has a huge trade surplus, and it's mainly due to oil sales, and there's nothing else happening. So we need to really rev up the other engines, right? So what are these other engines, and as per your analysis, where should we focus more?
Yeah, it's a pertinent question in terms of bilateral relationship, as this effort to diversify has been there for many years, but it has not happened somehow. And I think that the major focus of this particular summit was to actually come up with new areas and come up with more balance in bilateral trade. So first of all, I think that Russia over the past 3 years has rediscovered India as a country of economic opportunities. Before 2022, it was not the case because Russian businesses were too much focused on the Western markets. But the moment the Russian economy has become isolated from the West and cut off from the European market, it started to look for alternatives. And I think that that's how India's alliance has been reconsidered, rediscovered in a way. And now we see Russian businesses making inroads into the Indian market. And at this summit, we could see a very representative Russian delegation, particularly representatives of the Russian government economic bloc. I mean, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Economic Development officials, banking officials. Actually, the integration of banking systems is now growing further, with several Russian largest banks being already present in India, several banks looking to open their branches.
And that will also help with payments to evade the Western sanctions and all those things. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's part of the effort, is to make more integration of the financial systems to avoid reliance on any Western payment infrastructure. And I think that's been the case because now the trade is dominated by national currencies. And actually, Russian Central Bank is going to open its branch in India next year. It's also showing that this process is developing gradually, and Russia is looking forward to being more present, I mean, from an economic standpoint, in India. So I think that also, if you take up the issue of new areas, because you mentioned about diversification, I think that there are some areas where we could see some progress. So from the Indian side, now there is more interest to expand presence in pharmaceuticals. And one of the announcements of the summit was the establishment of pharmaceutical factory in one of the Russian regions, which should provide supply of Indian medicines to the Russian.
And there's also something on fertilizers also.
And the other one is on fertilizer. Another facility, another plant will be focused on, it will be an urea plant, which should ensure the uninterrupted supply of fertilizer from Russia to India. And it's also a joint venture. And from the Russian side, there are also some companies that are now establishing joint ventures with the Indian counterparts. There is already a success story in railways where the Indo-Russian joint venture is now responsible for producing Vande Bharat trains. I think there are some attempts to come up with joint production in civil aviation. The memorandum of understanding was signed recently, a few months back. And in shipbuilding, there are also some of the initiatives to produce different types of vessels. But I mean, at this summit, we have not seen any announcement, particularly in this sphere, but I think they may be coming in the next months.
Right. Yeah. So we're making a conscious effort both sides, including the private sectors, and that's how we can really make it a balanced economic relationship. But talking about announcements during the summit, the announcement that did not come, on which many people were waiting for, was some big ticket defense deal, and we didn't see any. But nonetheless, the negotiations on many fronts are continuing, and the cooperation, of course, is quite wide-ranging. India, of course, has diversified its arms suppliers over the years. Russia is no longer has the monopoly almost as it used to be in the past, so it's much more competitive. And in this sphere, the Russian weaponry was very, very effective during Operation Sindoor against Pakistan earlier in 2025. Nonetheless, many are of the view that Russia's salience as a defense, mainstay for India is going to reduce, relatively speaking. So, your thoughts on, can Russia remain competitive in the defense market in India, and co-production? Can we do something magical like a BrahMos again? A joint production. There's a talk about hypersonic missile systems and technology, and new anti-aircraft and aerial defense systems. So, tell our audience a little bit about the defense side, which is, of course, in a way, always been historically the main one. But maybe we are at a crossroads now, and something needs to be reorganized. What are your thoughts on the defense relationship as it stands now?
Russia hopes to remain competitive and to remain instrumental for Indian defense needs. I think that if we look at the relationship, again, since 2022, then the defense link has bounced back after a hiatus in 2022, 2023. So now we can see more intensive talks between defense officials, and actually the meeting between defense ministers on the sidelines of the India-Russia summit was important. They co-chaired Intergovernmental Commission on Military Technical Cooperation. There were no big-ticket announcements, as you said, but I think that it's a work in progress, because some of the significant deals, they require quite a lengthy process of bureaucracy, of coordinating technical modalities, also a procurement process sometimes is quite long and can take much time. So I think that there are some signs that the talks between the two countries are quite constructive. As you mentioned, after Operation Sindoor, I think there has been a growing interest from the Indian side, particularly in further procuring Russian air defense systems, which have proven themselves to be efficient. But at the same time, we can see that this subject remains obscure, and we don't see much details emanating from the negotiations process. It's logical because of the very sensitive geopolitical moment. I think that both sides try to not to reveal much detail about their talks. At the same time, I think that some of the MOUs that were previously reached in 2024 and early in 2025, they can be implemented and they can be announced next year. I think that India is also following the proceedings in the peace process over Ukraine, and that's how the situation may improve, or probably may become more appropriate for the two sides to come up with new defense deals.
Yeah, so the conflict in Ukraine has in many ways constrained maybe the full potential of the defense relationship with India, and that's something to be concerned about. In fact, I'll take you there, Dr. Zakharov. Prime Minister Modi and President Putin, when they met during the 23rd summit, the Indian Prime Minister made public remarks saying that we are not neutral, India is not neutral, India is on the side of peace, and we are willing to support any initiative to bring about a lasting ceasefire and end to the fighting in Ukraine. So on this account, how would you evaluate the Indian role? Because, behind the scenes, we have played some kind of a interlocutor kind of a role, passing on important messages and signals from the Europeans and the Americans to the Russians and vice versa, because, we have strategic partnership with the Western countries also, and that makes India unique. So your thoughts on this? And, ultimately, I think if the war stops, there's nothing like it, because that is probably going to be of great, utility for India, because we don't want to be pushed into a corner where we are being, where there are sanctions and all these things, and we are pressurized to take this side or that side. Of course, India has been very firm that we are not going to abandon Russia. But the ideal scenario is we should not even have to worry about this at all, right? So which means the war should stop. So your thoughts on the Indian role and the Indian interests in the Ukraine conflict?
If we track the meetings between Prime Minister Modi and President Putin since 2022, I think that the topic of Ukraine has been raised at every meeting. And I think India has had a very consistent position that it's on the side of peace, that the war should be stopped. And it's actually that it's not an era of war, as Prime Minister famously said in 2022. So I think that every summit, this topic has been discussed, and the Indian position is crystal clear in this regard. If we look at the India's role, as you rightly mentioned, India has kept lines of communication with all the sides, both with Moscow and Kiev. Prime Minister Modi visited Kiev in August 2024, shortly after visiting to Moscow in July 2024, which was an important signal as well. So I think that there are no doubts about India's standpoint and about India's message to all the sides that the war is not a solution. I think that with that said, there has been, India has limited its involvement in the peace process itself. So it has been cautious not to intervene in the negotiations that are going at different levels, both directly between Russia and Ukraine, and also between Russia and US and Ukraine. So the peace process now has made some progress, and there are hopes that this conflict may end sooner than it was the case before. At the same time, the issue is very intricate. There are many stakeholders. There are many conflicting interests of these stakeholders in this conflict. And I think that it may take some time to accommodate all these interests, because at the current stage, we can see much progress in the talks between US and Russia and US and Ukraine. But the crux of the matter is how to accommodate Russia's maximalist demands regarding territories, regarding the Ukrainian political status and the so-called demilitarization on the one side. And on the other side, the Ukrainian demands for sovereignty, for the territorial integrity, and for security guarantees. There are also interests from the European side, because Europe is also interested in the peace and some security framework for its continent. That's why I think that we probably should be quite patient, and this diplomatic effort may take some time to resolve all the issues.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there is no silver bullet that can solve the whole thing instantly, but we would still be hopeful that at least in the year 2026, finally, the guns will rest and the drones and the missiles will stop, and that, we can then look at many, projects that have been held back between India and Russia because of the war. And I think that's going to be highly valuable for all sides. Now, Dr. Zakharov, so far we have spoken about Western powers and Russia and how India is involved in this, in the Ukraine. But here in Asia, the big, 800-pound dragon, to use the metaphor, is China. And the Russia-China strategic partnership, parallel to the India-Russia strategic partnership, has also grown, and in fact has outgrown in some ways the India-Russia partnership, because the volumes of trade and the closeness when it comes to opposing the West and all these are much greater between Russia and China, right? So in that sense, some argue that the Russia-China strategic partnership overshadows the Russia-India one. So on the other hand, India has, as you know, adversarial relations with China, and we have border dispute, and there are a lot of provocations from the Chinese, even though we are trying to normalize relations with them. So from the Russian point of view, what is the Russian strategy to deal with this China-India rivalry and competition and conflict, and which is not going to go away anytime soon, because both are ambitious, and India wants to catch up and to be treated as an equal of China. So in that context, what is the Russian role? I mean, they've played some very creative, behind the scenes, character in the past when India and China had face-offs and all that. So what is the Russian strategy and how do they deal with this issue? Because the Indians tell them one story about, how China is a problem for us, when the Chinese probably tell them another story. So Russia is somewhere in between, right? So tell our audience a little bit about where Russia is when it comes to this RIC triangle.
I definitely understand where these concerns come from. I think that since 2022, the growing dependence of Russia on China has been quite evident. At the same time, probably we should not exaggerate this over-reliance at the moment, because so far it has been related to several particular areas. Like, for instance, in the technological sector, Russia is definitely dependent on the Chinese supplies and then on the Chinese assistance. China has also emerged as the only market for Russian gas supplies, and it's an area where China can demand quite a lot from the Russian counterparts. So in some economic sectors, there's clearly a quite specific situation for Russia where it needs some breathing space and where China can dictate terms. On the other side, I think when it comes to strategic areas, Russia has been quite cautious not to become trapped and not to become cornered and over-dependent on China. And if we look at their no-limits partnership, I think that there are some limitations to their engagement. At the same time, when it comes to India-China differences, I think that Moscow's consistent approach has been that of balancing policy. Moscow has been trying to be neutral and not to take sides and not to be compelled to take any sides, actually. So I think that there is a belief in Russia, both by Russian officials and experts, that the differences between India and China are manageable, and that it's even possible to come back to the idea of trilateral cooperation. You mentioned the RIC format, and Russia is pushing hard for the trilateral engagement, particularly with focus on Eurasia, Eurasian security issues, different regional crises. So Russia believes that it's possible to get back to this idea and to discuss the important issues of global and regional governance in a trilateral format. I think that if we take a leaf from the past, if we take an example of 2022 India-China crisis and Galvan clashes, I think that Russia's position was quite visible, that it was diplomatically neutral, and even at some point it was willing to expedite some military supplies to India in response to New Delhi's demands.
Yes.
Russia also emerged as a venue for India-China talks, which coincided with Russia's chairship of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So it was instrumental in providing the platform for India-China negotiations. Now, if we look at the current situation, I think that Moscow will also stick to its neutral position, but at the same time, a pertinent question, if Moscow is in a position to provide any expedited supplies to India in case of the need coming from the Indian armed forces. I think, of course, as long as Russia is engaged in its war in Ukraine, it's probably difficult to make these expedited deliveries, like we see the case with the S-400 units. So
a couple of the units are delayed, right?
Two out of 5 units are delayed now and postponed till 2026 or probably 2027. So making a link with your previous question, I think that if the war in Ukraine ends soon, it would be better both for Russia and India, because I think that Russia will be in a position to expedite supplies under the existing contracts and probably come up with new proposals relying on the overcapacity in production of military platforms that it has now.
Right. So last word, Dr. Zhakarov. So would you say India is equally important to Russia as China is, or would you say there is a pecking order and China is ahead of us when it comes to overall Russian priorities?
I think that there is no order of priorities. If we take a look at Russian conceptual documents like the foreign policy concept of 2023, I think that both China and India are highlighted as major partners in Asia, particularly in Eurasia. And I think that Russia tries to club the two together and not only build bilateral connections with them, but also sees there as partners for global solutions, for global ideas, and for
multipolar world.
For multipolar world and global governance, exactly.
Right. Okay, viewers, a very interesting discussion with Dr. Aleksei Zhakarov of the Observer Research Foundation. And essentially what he's saying is that, Russia-India ties have some glitches here and there, but overall, it's a continuous saga of high trust. And because of the political will at the top and the kind of bonhomie between the leaders that we have seen, it is taking us to a higher level. But nonetheless, there is, a possibility in the future, especially if the Ukraine war winds down, that we can ramp up the Russia-India cooperation even higher. And then we will not be under any dilemmas, strategic dilemmas regarding Western countries either. And of course, the Russia-China partnership is also very crucial. And we need to focus on what's happening there. And Indian interest is in making sure that Russia does not become over-reliant or over-dependent on China. And I think India has a role to play in that triangular dynamic as well. Let me thank Dr. Zakharov for joining me and for the important work you're doing here in India to make sure that the Russian scholarly voice is heard here. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you.
So viewers, the Russia-India partnership is a time-tested one, and it is going to continue to flourish. Although there have been some hiccups and challenges which we have discussed in the show today. And overall, the big message is that for a multipolar world order, we need to come together. And there are many areas and sectors in which we are now trying to expand the cooperation. Let's keep an eye on these new and emerging areas, especially apart from the old pillars of oil and defense. And we will make sure that this emerging world order is fairer and more equitable, and also more balanced, because balance of power is something that is very, very essential. And both Russia and India believe in those concepts, and they are working towards that in the broader Eurasian region. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.